Hey, safety stock is a commonly used approach which involves purchasing additional inventory to protect against variability in demand and lead times. However, despite being relatively simplistic, it is often used far too conservatively, resulting in overstock and wasted inventory. Today on LokadTV, we're going to explain why this method doesn't work and also discuss what are the alternatives that are open to supply chain professionals. So Johannes, before we get into sort of the problems with safety stock, perhaps we should start by just sort of explaining a little bit more about it. So how would you define safety stock?
So safety stock is emerged from the idea that once you have a forecast, if you just put in terms of stock an amount of stock that is just equal to your forecast, and if your forecast is balanced, then you have like a 50% chance to be out of stock. That's pretty much the definition of a balanced demand forecast. So as a consequence, you need more. So you need to have more in stock than what you forecast. And this delta between what you forecast and what you actually need to reasonably cover future demand is this so-called safety stock. So that's the general concept, is to add some extra buffer on top of your average forecast. But the reality is that safety stock nowadays has a much more narrow definition, because I would say the industry converge on one way of computing those safety stock, which is basically to assume that future demand and future lead times are normally distributed. And when I say normally, I mean like Gaussians. And then to apply this specific model to compute how much you should put in this safety stock.
So when did these ideas sort of come about, and why is it something that the market is so sort of hung up on?
I believe that safety stock is a good name. It sounds reassuring, and never underestimate, the power of a good brand. Safety stocks, it feels, well, safe. If what do you have? Well, we are playing it safe. We have those safety stocks. Yeah, that sounds like a good move. Yeah, if you have to choose between a safe method and an unsafe method. I mean, would you choose an unsafe stock? No, better play it safe. Safety stock, yes, way better. So literally, I think it was having a catchy name was part of what made this very specific approach successful. Then, again, for a long time, computers were exceedingly weak. So we transitioned from, I would say, computation done by hand, where normal distribution was the best thing we could do, which was better than what was before, which was like no numerical recipe at all. And then in the very, very early computers, let's say in the 60s, 70s, late 60s, early 70s, well, it was kind of people were struggling so much with things that were so basic that it was good enough. And then, well, I think many practitioners just fell asleep and the whole thing stayed there. And what is interesting is that the key concept of having the idea of this extra buffer, it still makes sense nowadays. What doesn't make sense is to say that all the uncertainty can be kind of collapsed to a normal distribution, both for demand and lead times. And it's especially absurd as far as lead times are concerned.
Okay, this idea of it being unsafe might sound a little bit extreme to some people. So why do we think it is a little bit unsafe? Where do these key difficulties with safety stock sort of come from?
So safety stock, just to give you an idea of how it works, you start with your demand, and then basically what you end up with is to create a stock that is like a certain fraction of the demand, a constant fraction. So you're going to say, I'm adding, I forecast 100 and I'm going to add 80 units as an 80% of my original demand, and that's my safety stock, and that's a direct consequence of choosing a fixed service level with a normal distribution assumption on top of the demand. So what sort of problem do you run into? Well, the reality is that when you do that, you ignore that completely seasonality. Your demand forecast is seasonal very frequently, and that's very expected. People that expect that. But the reality is that uncertainty is seasonal as well. When you go into a safety stock model, the classical flavor, you dismiss entirely all the patterns that are impacting the uncertainty itself, and the uncertainty is seasonal like the rest. But then you also applying, I would say, a normal distribution to the demand is already quite a stretch. But when you do that for the lead times, it becomes like completely insane. Just to give you an idea, let's assume that you have a supplier that can deliver things in 2 days to you. You are in Europe, your supplier is in Europe. It's basically 1 day of truck to ship stuff to you. So your lead time is 2 days, except when your supplier has a stock out, and in this case, the delay can be anything up to 3 months. So look at how the lead times look like. I mean, the lead times are going to be like a strong, what it's called a mode, statistical mode. So it's 2 days of lead time, like literally all the time, except on those rare situations where you have a stock out supplier side, and in which case it can take up to 3 months. So this is not a bell-shaped curve. It is something that is completely different. It's like a big spike around your nominal lead time, and then something that can spread to not infinity, but very long delays, very long delays, if you face this very specific event, which is supplier stock out. So it's typically where it's trying to model, a circle with a square, and it's a very, very bad approximation. I mean, you can, it just fundamentally, just like the children toys, it just do not match.
So what we're saying is anything where there's any small amount of even variability, if there's any seasonality, if there's any basic unknowns, that's when safety stock basically doesn't work.
It's not just any kind of variability, it's that anything that can, bump the situation, that can trigger, situation like, for example, demand for a product can evaporate, and sometimes it's complete for reasons that are completely outside your control. Maybe suddenly, for example, you're selling chicken, and you would say, well, sales of chicken are super steady, and then you have on the news there is the avian flu, and people literally almost stop eating chickens for 6 months. So suddenly that's a sort of things that just are not normal. According to your normal distribution, massive deviations do not exist, period. Or they are statistically so insignificant that they would never happen. But when you look at real supply chains, large deviations, I mean, truly surprising thing happen like all the time. Not all the time for all the products, but for any large company, like there will be no single quarter without having at least a couple of big surprises. And again, that's where those safety stocks are pretty bad, is that according to the safety stock theory, which is basically those normal distributions both for demand and lead times, those surprisingly large deviations do not exist. And the problem is when you start optimizing your supply chain and saying, well, those sort of things will never happen. And the reality is that when they do happen, well, things go really, really bad, which in supply chain terms means really, really costly.
Okay, so I kind of guess that the best way to kind of deal with these certain bumps and these certain surprises, so to speak, is by applying a bit of a probabilistic approach. Why is that approach so much better than safety stocks? What are the key benefits of that?
So the thing is, what happens when you have a model that significantly underestimates your risk? What will happen? Well, you would say, well, I'm going to have not enough stock. That's, after all, I have a model that dramatically underestimates my risk. So normally what should happen is safety stock should actually drive me to a situation where I have much more stock out than what the model would tell. But this is not what is happening in practice. Why? Because actually people, supply chain practitioners, they react and they adapt. And they make the problem kind of worse also, unfortunately. So what is happening is that first you try to use your safety stock model. It vastly underestimates the risk, meaning that in your software you're going to say, I want 98% service level. what will happen in reality, because you have underestimated all those tail events, both in lead time and demand, is that you're going to get, let's say, 85% service level. So it's very, very bad. You're very far from your 98% target for your service level. So what do? Well, you use the silver bullet, which is an extra multiplicative parameter to your safety stock. So you started with your model with normal distribution assumption extra. And then, because literally everybody who has been using safety stock for a while realized that, oh, we have those problems, so we need to kind of inflate those safety stocks. So what will happen is that companies are going to introduce those inflation factors. And there is basically two ways of doing that. Either you explicitly put a factor, so you would say, well, it's like the safety stock formula, but multiplied by 2. Why 2? Because, well, it's what I've observed. Or you say, well, in the software, I want 98% service level, but I'm going to enter 99.9 because it's the way I can obtain empirically this 98%. So what is happening is that basically, because your model underestimates your risk, you inflate your safety stocks, and you inflate them quite uniformly. And thus lies the true problem, is that by doing that, you're actually generating significant overstocks. You see, that's the paradox, is that you have a model that underestimates the risk. So basically, you inflate your coverage, your safety stocks everywhere, and thus, in the end, you do generate, by this very process, a lot of overstocks. So that's very funny, because that you start with something that is called a safety stocks, but it's kind of unsafe by design, because of this very process that is going to happen very predictably.
So what you're sort of saying is you're always going to sort of fine-tune to kind of a worst case scenario, and everyone's going to fine-tune to that day when they really need the stock, and then if the stock sort of changes and the demand sort of changes, they've still got that added sort of safety factor in there.
Yes, and you're going to have this added safety stock like everywhere, because it's a funny thing that people are going to like micromanage their forecasts and spend a lot of time on tuning the forecast, but then so they are going to compute everything down to the last gram to be super precise, and then thanks to the safety stock, they can round it all to the next metric tone, just because they have this inflation factor that is going to be applied pretty much uniformly across all products. I'm a bit stereotyping, but it's just I would say a loose approximation of what is actually happening, or that I've seen happen many times.
So how do you deal with those customers that are adamant they need that extra safety value, they need that safety stock there, they need that buffer there? I mean, what's the key message that you sort of need to sort of translate to them?
So the key message is, first, safety stocks are unsafe, and they are also completely fictive. It's a fiction. In the end, in your warehouse, you don't have two kinds of stocks: the working stock that serves the demand and the safety stocks that serves the uncertainty. You have only one pile of stock. So the question is, first, is this amount of stock that you have suitable to serve your clients? And if but actually you don't actually have that much control on the level of stocks, because you don't have control over customer demand. What you do have control on are the purchase orders or the manufacturing orders that you pass. So in the end, what you should really focus on is the decision that you can make and whether they're good or not. So the problem is that with safety stocks is that it kind of distracts you away from the decisions that you can make that are in your hands and that have a real physical impact on your supply chains, which are those purchase orders or supply orders or manufacturing orders. So that's the key message, would be focus on the decision that you're making, not on I would say relatively arbitrary parameters of your ERP.
Okay, the problem with a sort of probabilistic approach is it's relatively complex. You've got a different demand curve for every single item in your catalog, whereas the nice thing about safety stock is it's relatively simplistic. You're just adding on a certain sort of buffer for every single item and every curve. It's fairly simple. Is there anything in between that a supply chain executive can use that's not quite as complex as maybe a Lokad probabilistic approach, but is a little bit better and a little bit more apt than maybe a sort of safety stock kind of approach?
I believe that we are touching a bit the maybe not the paradox, but one of the small paradox of modern statistical analysis is that, yes, in your way, you see the safety stock is what is called in statistics a parametric approach. I mean, you have a parametric approach that you have a model that has like two parameters, a mean and a variance, and that's your normal distribution for you. And you can use this model and tune the parameters. So that's the parametric approach. And then you realize, oh, my parametric model is a complete misfit to the situation. Just like a square is a very bad approximation of a circle. And then you would say, well, maybe if we add one more side, we have a pentagon. Okay, a pentagon is getting closer to a circle. And that's good. And maybe if we use an hexagon, that would be even closer to a circle. And this is, so yes, you can use, parametric model that where you refine, you can add a zero inflated coefficient to your normal distribution. You can add another term for to make it a bit more fat tailish or something. You can add more complexity to this model, but the reality is that very, very soon, very, very, very quickly, you end up with special functions, which is, and this is even more cryptic. I mean, it becomes very, very cryptic. First, I'm not even sure that many supply chain practitioners know the fine print of how do you compute the tail of a normal distribution. But then if you start using like special fat tail distribution, I mean, you would have to look up the Wikipedia to even get the mathematical distribution, the mathematical definition of those functions, and most of the time that would not even help you. So bottom line is you can, go for more complex explicit model, but it becomes very horrid in terms of mathematical notation and everything. And so it's actually simpler to use things that are more like machine learning style, that are a bit more opaque, but that can fit any kind of distribution, but then you lose your explicit formulas. But in a way, it's not so much loss, because the reality is that as soon as you want to properly combine the uncertainty that you have on the lead time with the uncertainty that you have on the demand, you cannot expect like a closed formula. You cannot expect something that you can write in 5, lines of Excel. It's going to be complicated no matter what. But also it is required. You cannot just dismiss the fact that you have subtle interaction between your lead times and your demand, and that combining those two is a requirement. So I would say, yes, you have to lose that. In theory, you could find an in-between with more sophisticated parametric model that are not, in theory, not so opaque, but in practice, as soon as you go away from normal distribution, you end up with things that are super horrid to write, mathematically speaking, and that are as opaque as a fully opaque machine learning technique.
Okay, we've spoken a lot today about the wastage in safety stock, and basically that's wasted money at the end of the day. Why is it something that people haven't tried to improve, and why is it something that really hasn't been focused on and is just kind of left to at the minute?
Again, I think it's a good name, safety stocks, and also I think people underappreciate. I mean, many supply chain practitioners underappreciate the fact that having a good understanding of the future demand is only the start. Future demand is not the only source of uncertainty. Future lead times are another source, and you have other kind of problems. And basically you end up being super distracted by the pure demand forecast. And by the way, also, if you had an absolutely perfect demand forecast, then your safety stock would be zero and everything would be trivial. So there is also this illusion that if you can fix once for all the forecasting problem, then all the other problems evaporate, which is only true if you could actually have this zero error forecast, which is not possible. So you see, by having this delusion that you will be able to have like something that is like a perfect forecast, then all the other problems are gone. And now the probabilistic approach is also something where you give up on this big dream of having a perfect forecast. You say, well, the forecast is going to be forever imperfect, and now, well, we have to live with the consequence of this imperfection. And that means that, well, as a first order consequence of this imperfection is that you need to start paying attention to the consequence of this uncertainty, and safety stocks hurts badly because it's like a super crude modeling of the consequence of this uncertainty.
So what you're basically saying is it's always the forecast that is actually getting the blame.
Exactly. I mean, that's also the problem, is that with safety stocks, people are always going to fall back to blame the forecast when actually the forecast was just as good as it could have been. I mean, and there are situations where it's fundamentally very hard to do much better than the moving average. Yes, you can do better than moving average by taking into account, seasonality and a couple of things, but let's be realistic, against a very well-tuned moving average, there are many situations where it's very hard to reduce the error by more, let's say, than a third compared to a very robust moving average. A third is a lot. It's worth a shot, but it doesn't, eliminate the problem by any stretch. So that means that you're still left with a big residual, forecasting error, and blaming the forecast is moot. And very frequently, it's that literally there are big mistakes that are done afterward, and those mistakes are, unlike the forecast, which is super hard to improve, or the mistakes that are done afterward are, areas of low-hanging fruits for relatively dramatic improvements.
Okay, and to sort of start wrapping things up today, what's the key message we should take away? Should supply chain executives start throwing away all their safety stock calculations and sort of embrace those stockouts and then understand their forecasts better? I mean, what's the key message today?
The message would be, don't trust mathematical models that were invented for the primary purpose of being able to do the computation by hand. I mean, it's not a reasonable proposition to say that your supply chain should be driven by the fact that you could keep operating that way without computers. It's not a compelling story. It doesn't really make sense. Just like it would not make sense to say, oh, we preserve this process because, just in case our trucks would stop working, we could carry the stuff on our back. So we need to maintain, a large amount of backpacks just in case we don't have trucks anymore. That doesn't really make sense. And the trick with safety stocks is that because of good name, good branding, and a relatively what appears to be like an obscure technicality of supply chain optimization, like a completely outdated methodology can still persist. So my suggestion would be broader than just very specific safety stock, is challenge the way, when you tackle numerical optimization of your supply chain, challenge your assumptions, challenge them deeply. And it doesn't take to be a mathematician to challenge them. What it takes is just have a look whether, those assumptions are actually matching the reality of your supply chain, just like, does this square is a good approximation of a circle, and can you just add a few sides to the square to get it very, very close to a circle? And the answer is, well, not really.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap things up there, but who knows, maybe people will start referring it to as unsafety stock maybe now.
Yes.
Okay, so that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in again, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.